Well, good morning and welcome to another FS Club webinar. Today is a really fantastic one. We're going to be talking about uncertainty deconstructed, why we should have seen it coming. As you'll be aware, Her Majesty, sadly deceased, went to LSE approximately 12 years ago and muttered something along the lines of, why had nobody seen it all coming? Which, as usual, in a very short and pithy statement, she had put her finger right on the nub of the issue. And here to explore it, and accompanied by a book that they just happened to have written, are Dr. Bruce Harvey, who's the managing director and founder of Strategy Foresight, and my dear friend Daushan Humza, who's an independent director and strategic advisor and does a lot of work at Gresham College. Now, you'll know me. I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and I'm really only able to provide these webinar sessions to you thanks to the tolerance, generosity, and wide-ranging interests of our sponsors. But as our sponsors are in technology, economics, and finance, risk has been, certainly over the last 3 to 4 decades, the dominant paradigm in the markets, ever since we began to see risk as fundamental to finance, the original Basel I Accords in banking, Solvency I and Solvency II in insurance. Everybody has something to say on risk, and the great book by Bernstein on risk, of course, is legendary. But it's not so straightforward, nor is it so simple. One of my favorite quotes is from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where one of the characters, Vrumfondel, shouts, "That's right, we demand rigidly defined areas of doubt and uncertainty," which I think kind of says it all. And today, our authors are going to be exploring that. Now, the agenda will be familiar to many of you. We're going to get out of the way as quickly as possible, but a few items of housekeeping. Yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will be available approximately midday on Wednesday. Yes, the slides not only will be available, but are available. But most importantly, what makes these sessions different is we encourage interaction. And to do that, simply type questions, comments, or observations into the GoToWebinar chat room, and I will feed them into a discussion with Daushan and Bruce, who are fortunately on this side of the world, based in central London and Croydon. So we'll expect much snappier answers than on some of our international calls, or at least I should be certain about that. Now, we've got quite a few people online, so do get those comments, questions, and observations in, as I say, early, and all of them will be sent to Bruce and Daushan with your email attached. So if you want to get in touch with them, compliment them, thank them, whatever, please go ahead and use that facility there. Anyway, to get things off, Daushan and Bruce would like a little view on what you, the audience, think. So do you agree with this statement? Uncertainty is not really uncertainty at all, but just demonstrates a lack of foresight, imagination, and vision. Now, Daushan and Bruce, one of the great things about the FS Club community is that it is highly opinionated, and we've now got well over 50% of people have answered that question. I'll leave it open just a little bit longer as we hit 75% and 80%, and we're just about to close that poll, folks, and let's have a quick look. I think you might want to make a quick comment on this, or perhaps save it to your talk, but I think you'll see that the audience, by a ratio of approximately 2 to 1, probably agree with your views. And we have a second poll we'd like to run, if we may, and that one is, what one factor will improve decision-making given uncertainty, or decision-making under uncertainty? So that poll's being launched again. We're unable to vote, sadly, but I think you'll be hearing Daushan and Bruce's thoughts on this. And yet again, guys, the audience is quick off the buzzers, with 50% having voted, 60% now, 70, and I'm going to leave it open for another 5 or 6 seconds just to get those numbers up there. Great. Well, with most of the folks having voted, we'll just have a quick look at those results as well. Wow. Diversity, the third point, is 60% of the audience is thinking there, 60%. And
Right.
for those of you who work for a management consultancy, you've got a lot of sales and marketing work to do. given a 0% mark there. Well, gentlemen, we've got a warm and very interested audience out there. The floor is yours.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you, Michael, and thank you, guests and people who've signed up for hoping that what we have to say is going to be worthwhile. Well, we certainly hope it will be. What I'll do, yes, we called this book Uncertainty Deconstructed. In an ideal world, I wanted the title, We Should Have Seen It Coming, but Springer, the publishers, are a bit conservative. They're more academic-y, so I had to drop that as the main title. Anyway, I think Uncertainty Deconstructed is a suitable replacement. Let me first of all, I think, just to kick off and to give a bit of an anchor for the session, I thought I'd give you a definition of uncertainty. A lot of them exist, but this is the one that we use. And if we can have the next slide, please. Yeah, the first two are pretty bland. The order or nature of things is unknown. The consequences or events are unpredictable. The next two are important. Credible probabilities to possible outcomes can't be assigned, and it's very difficult to identify a probability distribution. Now, those last two are really what those of you may have heard of the Knightian interpretation. I mean, Frank Knight came up with a definition of risk and uncertainty way back in 1921. God, that's over 100 years ago now. And it gets forgotten every generation, but it's still probably the most basic one. So if you want to dig that one out, there's a bit of a thing on offline, then please do so. But it is those last two things. It says that you can't assign any numbers or any quantitative element about it. So you're really having to look at more qualitative methods. And that is why, if you look at those there, it is different from risk. And I won't say any more at this stage, except that I see that the main difference between uncertainty and risk is that, a lot of people might argue with this, is that risk can be quantified, uncertainty can't, but you can model it. The other thing I also say is that to also be aware that when high levels of uncertainty and complexity prevail, it's better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. I think Keynes came up with a version of that way back in the 1930s. Now, when faced with uncertainty, it's a complex subject. So when you're faced with the complexity, don't ignore it. The problem with simplification is that it can obscure unwanted, unanticipated details, and so increase the likelihood of unreliable performance. I wasn't the one that actually identified that. There's a couple of organizational behavioralists in the States called Week and Mitchell, who were looking at resilience, and they identified that you don't want to oversimplify these things are complicated, and you've got to get into it. Now, with complexity, the way I look at it is that if you're going to tackle a complex subject, I think it's very important to deconstruct it, hence the title, Uncertainty Deconstructed. And therefore, at the primary level, there are the three areas in which I deconstruct that. If we can have a look at the next slide, please. Yeah, it's a simple triangle. At the top, we've got three axes here. The structural components, which is, as we say, kind of the elements of the components, the evidence base, whatever. I'll go into a bit more detail of that in a second. We have scenarios, and we identified two main versions of scenarios, the reactive and the exploratory. And the third one, this really came through when we were writing the book, that you can have all the best methods and techniques in the world, but it's people that actually determine their level of understanding about uncertainty. And we bring into the situation all sorts of biases and heuristics. And as Darshan, I think, alluded to earlier, a lot of the work in that area was done by Kahneman as well. So we fall back on that as well. So those are the three kind of core elements. Now, you might say I've missed out methods, tools, and techniques. Well, they're somewhere situated in the middle. I came across about 1,000 different methods to do with decision making, decision support methods, and whatever. No one covers everything, but in the book, I do bring in some different methods and techniques, some of which you may not have heard before, and it's not just the usual suspects. So MTT sit in the middle. They're not the be and end all of it, and I'm not going to be pushing any one particular method. If we go to the next slide, I'll break down these three axes into a bit more detail. This kind of follows kind of the chapter layout of the book. There is a final element, which are the case studies, of which Dash will be talking about one particular area. But in terms of the main elements of the, if you like, it's not too academic, but the more technical aspects of deconstruction, there are three areas. The structural components. Now, I've already alluded to the fact that you've got uncertainty, you've got risk, and you've got uncertainty. So we try to locate where uncertainty exists along this overall risk spectrum. But then the key thing is to what is the problem of uncertainty we are trying to address? Not all problems are the same. You've got puzzles, and then you have a simple problem. You've got complex problems, but they're not. But they can be addressed, such as, for example, an aeroplane engine is very complex, but you can understand it by deconstructing the parts which actually make up the functioning of a jet engine. And then we have the wonderful wicked problems that Rittel and Weber came up with. These are problems in their purest forms you actually can't solve, and it mainly can't solve them because of us human beings. Unfortunately, we tend to mess things up. There's all different actors with different perspectives and so on. So we look at that time-based criteria. What do we mean by the future and looking forward? There we've got what do we mean by short-term, medium-term, long-term? Short-term, 6 months for a financial analyst is a long time, but for a physicist, it's a blink of an eye, not worth bothering about. Then we've got other aspects of time. You've got linear time, you've got exponential time, you've got cycles, trends, megatrends, and so on. So this area looks at that. Evidence-based, very important to try to look at what evidence are we using to make judgments about making decisions under uncertainty. And we look at areas such as dark data, fake data, and so on. Ways of seeing the future. Here I break it down into two main areas. We know about forecasting, we know about foresight. People assume foresight is very much longer term, forecasting is shorter term. And there are two different schools, and they often argue about futures and forecasting. I see them as being a continuum. You have to constantly look at the future, short-term forecasting, and then you're always updating your foresight further methods out. And then you can look at the future and then go backwards. So I look at a way of integrating the two disciplines rather than seeing them as two separate disciplines. Scenarios, very simple, I cover here. I've identified them as being reactive, like we reacted to COVID-19, and then we have the exploratory. This is where we try to look at what the future might hold, and so we can actually preempt some of the uncertainties which may be hitting us at some time in the future. Now, the other part here is what I call scenario derivatives. If you look at COVID, we're not, it wasn't just about making sure we got the vaccine. There were secondary and tertiary factors such as the impact on the health service. It affected social inequality, social mobility. It's affected education systems. And this is particularly where I think Doshan's case study on social mobility will come in as it's a subject in its own right, but it actually came as also as a spin-off of the COVID-19. It was exposed because of COVID. So yes, the derivative scenarios, they're ever changing. What might be a derivative becomes a main one down the stream. But it's important to not just think about scenarios as being a discrete situation. And then finally, behavior. It's the hidden influence, how we deal with uncertainty. And yeah, these are all about cognitive biases and dissonance, anomie and alienation. In fact, it's how we human beings mess things up. And then finally, I also look at ways in which we can actually mitigate the impact of this, how we overcome our biases. You can never get rid of them, but you can actually mitigate the impact by recognizing them in the first place. So yeah, that's how I see deconstruction. Now we've deconstructed uncertainty, I always moved into the area of how do we actually profile it. And if we go to the next slide, this is an area which you've always most of you would have seen Rumsfeld talking about his version of knowns and unknowns back in 2002, and I call this the Rumsfeldium interpretation. So he spoke correctly about the known and the unknown. Now, in a classic way, if it's two elements, you can create a 2 by 2 matrix. But he only covered three areas, which are the known knowns, the things we know about, the known unknowns, the things we know that we don't know, and then the unknown unknowns, the things we don't know that we don't know. He actually ignored this fourth category here as the unknown knowns. And this is where I think most of the mess happens. Okay, that's kind of the overall framework. Let's try and go into the, if we go into the next slide, I'll talk about quadrants 1, 2, and 4. So we have the identifiable known, we have the known knowns. I know what I know. It's often validated data, it's formal and tacit knowledge. We're comfortable with it. Then we have what we call the known unknowns. I know what I don't know. Now, back in the early 2000s, a futurist called Peter Schwartz, you may have, he's written a couple of books. He wrote a book called Inevitable Surprises. These are events that we know will happen, we just don't know when. So, for example, we know that Vesuvius, the volcano, is years overdue from a big explosion. So we know that there are certain events. We were warned about 7/7, the terrorist attacks after 9/11, and then in 7/7, the security services told us we should expect some form of attack here. Now, these inevitable surprises are good to the extent that at least if we know they're likely to happen, we don't know when, where, or how, or even the severity, but at least we can start acknowledging that these uncertainties are likely to happen in some way, and we can develop contingency plans, and we can do emergency response activity. Don't get too cocky about this, that once we've identified the known unknowns, because we find that contingency plans can fail up. What was it Mike Tyson said, you know, the famous boxer? He said, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. And we've seen this recently. If you look at the Manchester, the Grenfell situations where the service emergency did have certain plans in place, but they actually failed. However, it is an area which is very important, and we'll see as we move along, this is really the best we can do in handling uncertainty. We want to bring everything down to the level of known unknowns. At least we can think about them. And then we have got the unknown unknowns. I don't know what I don't know. True black swans. Now, frankly, I think this is a useless, if we don't know, we don't know, but it's not worth thinking about it. The trouble is everybody falls back on a black swan, being a black swan event, when really most events that take people by surprise aren't. You've just not thought about it careful enough. So if we go back into the next slide, we see that this is the quadrant 3, the unknown unknowns. This is, I don't know what I know, or I think I know, but it turns out that I don't. Now, these unknown knowns can be interpreted, well, as I said, those areas there. It is a form of hubris, or you've got analysts who are really missing often quite strong links in a particular situation. Either way, weak signals are manifest here, but often due to a variety of behavioral factors and biases, they're ignored. Behavioral factors, us, are to the fore in this quadrant, with actors suffering from amnesia, denial, blind spot, groupthink, silo thinking, and hubris, sometimes all or a combination of such behaviors. And Kahneman actually did a lot of work in this area. Any of these behaviors can distort our judgment, making judgment about a decision, particularly in relation to the future. Event indicators in this quadrant, they're asymmetric and non-linear, which makes it difficult to ascertain the relative importance of both individual and clustered signal. Now, this is a challenge to the inclination to weight the variables too early. A lot of people say, well, can't we weight factors? The trouble is, if we don't know enough information about it, there's higher levels of uncertainty. You don't want to start putting in weighting factors, because they could be impacted by levels of biases that we can identify. So don't be in too much of a hurry to weight those variables too soon. And if you like, in the real world, it's the dictum that policy-driven evidence should be challenged by evidence-based policy. It's very pertinent in this quadrant. As a result, this is the most insidious, if I call it pernicious, of the quadrants, largely due to a number of these behavioral factors as identified above. We think we know what or where the problem is or might occur, but can we handle the inherent complexities, or do we even have the tools, let alone the desire to deployment, to address some such complexity-based uncertainty? Groupthink and dogma-based policy are the real enemies here, and the issue is whether the stakeholders themselves are prepared to explore the outcomes which may produce uncomfortable truths. And remember, not uncomfortable truths aren't always bad. Some of them might be good as well. In other words, weak signal identification is as much challenged by the individual and group willingness to accept such signals through bias intervention as by the strength of the signal itself. It's here that you may have heard a term called the zoo. This is the space that you have to enter, the zone of an uncomfortable debate. And the trouble is that disruptive and often cataclysmic nature of such events, it makes for uncomfortable reading. So we have to think about the unthinkable, which is why when they do occur, they're too readily deemed to belong to quadrant 4, a black swan. In the vast majority of cases, they're not, and they just demonstrate a lack of foresight. So in summary, we need to shift the decision-making perspectives from seeing unexpected events as being unknown knowns or even unknown unknowns to quadrant 2. At least we can, if we think about it, it can happen. And therefore we've got other methods such as hierarchy-based methods when we can start introducing other pieces of information to and policies, formal policies laid out from an evidence base to try and put those into some better perspective. So yes, it's a behavioral transformation from getting more people into the known unknown box. That's not, as I said, everybody has a plan, and until you get punched in the mouth. It's not perfect, but at least you recognize it. And too many decisions are made because they're still impacted or still reflect a behavior within that quadrant 3, the unknown knowns. Okay, let's look at a case study. I said on the scenario sides that we got reactive, like COVID-19, and we've got COVID-19, and we had exploratory runs. Exploratory runs, yeah. What is interesting about Dolshan, he's taken a real case of social mobility. Now we could say, you can take that as being an exploratory scenario. There's enough to explore in there, which I think you'll see why in a minute. But at the same time, it has had an impact. It's a derivative scenario from, should we say, the COVID-19. So, Dolshan, over to you.
Thanks, Bruce. And I guess we're going to reflect on the questions, I hope, on the polls, because that's very interesting, particularly our definition of uncertainty is not really uncertainty, but we're more expansive. So when we're looking at uncertain events here, we've taken the wicked problem, and there are many wicked problems. We're obviously living through some wicked problems at the moment, if we look at what's happening in the economy, etc. But also we've had the wicked problems of Brexit. We've got wicked problems with, is it the NHS or the nation's health? So framing is important when we look at a wicked problem. But before I go into social mobility, what is a wicked problem? Bruce alluded to this earlier on. And there's a very good definition of a wicked problem that I think comes from Professor Sally Braveford of Southampton University. And that definition is a wicked problem is one that is difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize. So the challenge we have is how do we frame that in a very dynamic world? Now, if I take social mobility or social inequality as the case study that we have here, we accept with a UK lens that this is a divided society, not according to the very obvious physical characteristics. And talking about characteristics, question 2 of the poll was very enlightening, looking at the 59% that talked about, I think, broadly diversity as a way forward. But this is really a division between the haves and have-nots, based on privilege, money, and opportunity. So improving social mobility is one of the major interventions that can help. Now, we've seen how wicked or tricky that is over the last recent days, and the decisions that have to be made in terms of improving social mobility or reducing social inequality. The problem statement that I developed when we looked at this social mobility case study and actually ran it through the process is that we still live in a country where an individual's future potential is more defined by the circumstances of their birth, especially parental income, family wealth, and privilege. There's a lot of data and insight over many decades about this, and there are a lot of studies and research for the way forward. I should have shared a photo. If I lost this research by my desk, it goes higher than the middle tier of my desk that I read through. But we've tried to condense that and summarize it on one page. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but if we go to the next slide, which will look quite frightening. And what you see there is a mind map of 4 dimensions primarily. What hinders social mobility in the UK? What are the drivers that can improve it? And then we've got what I call linear national impact and linear marginal impact. And why do I use the word linear? Well, here are some obvious solutions that can improve social mobility and equality. Reduce the uncertainty for people who are underestimated. But they're linear. They're based on what we know, they're based on existing thinking. And as we saw from the poll, there is a greater need for more diverse thinking. So I'll go on to the process here without running through the solutions on this mind map. So the process is critical. We look at using psychology, creativity, behavioral science, in addition to metrics and past models, to expand the solution space. We can only do that when we have more diverse, high quality people in the room, looking at what exists and representing the end community, in this case, those who are underestimated. The model we used in this case, and I'll explain it on the next slide, is Fibonacci morphological analysis, working with Bruce and the team to frame the challenge and then bring in more creative thinking. So if we go to the next slide, please. Sorry, slide before. Thank you. So the 3 phases that we have is to generate the problem space. It's a 10-step process, but I'll break it down to 3 phases. Those first 6 steps is really to get the people together to identify the main problem, then to work with that team to focus on a question and facilitate it. From phase 1, we have a framing, and framing the question is critical. Phase 2 is where we perform this cross-consistency assessment, and that cross-consistency assessment requires a team to work together and match different states against other parameters. Now, working that creates a significant problem space, but the beauty of working with certain software is we can take that problem space, apply it through the cross-consistency matrix, and refine the solution space. With those parameters, again working through the software, we get to phase 3. Now, phase 3 has the advantage where we can eliminate the vast majority, 95%, of that original problem space. So we have more viable and more consistent solutions. And these solutions can be presented as what-if scenarios. Clearly, a what-if scenario at the moment is about what if the political willpower changes? What if taxes change? So we can apply what-if scenarios to the solutions and then overlay creative thinking to get to more oblique solutions as well. But what it does, it takes a lot of insight, a lot of parameters, as we've shown in the previous mind map, and can narrow it down and then through the software, start to put parameters to get to more viable solutions and have certainly a more engaged debate around what either policy matters or other interventions are required. So I think that's just to give you a highlight. We have more detail in the book about that, of social mobility and social inequality, but I'll hand over to Bruce to wrap it up with the key takeaways.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll rattle. I've realised time's moving on, so I'll rattle through these next set of key takeaways. Some of them apply to uncertainty, some of them are fairly general, but here goes. Is the difference between strategic and tactical in decision making understood? Everybody talks about strategy when very often they actually fail to connect about tactical situations. I come across the story, I think it was in the cricket. To those of you interested in cricket, they had this series in the summer called the 100, and you have 100 balls, and then you had this timeout halfway through. And what do they call it? A strategic timeout. No, it's not. It's a tactical timeout. So make sure you understand the difference between strategy and tactics, because that can actually how you come up with solutions to, or ideas and concepts to address uncertainty. How resilient do you want to be? Simple question, but do you want to be very simple in your resilience and cover 2 or 3 areas, or do you really want to deep dive into the topic? Identify early on as to what is at stake. Are you prepared for some uncomfortable truth? As he said, we talked about the Zood. You have to be prepared to go into a zone of uncomfortable debate. And some organizations and some people aren't really prepared when it comes to push comes to shove, aren't really prepared to go that far. Again, try not to fall into the trap of oversimplification. Everybody says it's important to simplify, but some problems are so complex that in order to address them, you have got to go into the detail, I'm afraid. Get acceptance and understand that foresight actions, they aren't just about the longer term, a future, someplace out here, but the future starts now, the next second. We've already started it, and therefore that's the time span you have to do. Don't think of it as something that's coming in the field. Be anticipatory rather than reactive. We've identified the 2 types of scenario. You don't want to always be in react mode. Anticipate these things that can happen, and then we start thinking quadrant 2. We start thinking about inevitable surprises. Make the planners aware that the future's dynamic. Move away from fixed cycle planning and control. It's constantly, and then in our current world, with so much information flying about, the situations are changing second by second. So we have to adapt our planning processes to accept that reality. Operationally, pay serious attention to, kind of linked to the one above, to frequently updating our contingency plan. Run regular simulation exercises, and that's, and when I mean by regular type.
Bruce, there's a lot of questions here, and maybe we can slide up.
Not left to one person or department. Always challenge management thinking. Have we transformed ourselves? What have we learned? Final slide, which I want to wrap up on. It's very short. Our postscript. We need to change our perception of uncertainty. It's something we can't control. We have to a proposition that most future events are foreseeable when seen as inevitable surprises, and that most of the problems are due to our own biases and lack of imagination. And we can treat uncertainty. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, we've sadly not got quite as much time for questions as I'd like, so I'll have to ask you to be quite pithy, please. Trevor Hilder is curious, do you think that our education system, which encourages people to give the right answer, makes people intolerant of uncertainty and therefore prone to prematurely jump to an answer?
Dalton?
Yeah, I do. I mean, this is why I love the poll, Michael, and the results, because it talks about, we're talking about imagination being the missed aspect here. And we're using uncertainty based on what we know, the past models and linear thinking. We need to break that. And we need to break that as evidenced during the last 2-3 years in terms of how creative we are and how we embrace other viewpoints, which really reflects on question 2 in the poll and the very significant, I think, 59% on those thinking differently, as opposed to the fallback of management consultants being more linear. I don't know if that addresses it, Michael.
Okay. Hugh Purser is curious, does expectation control help in managing uncertainty? For example, does scenario analysis help at all?
Well, well, I think the problem with the scenario analysis, I always ask the question, who decides what the inputs are? You do, everybody comes up with 3 or 4 scenarios. You know, who determines those? Is it the boss man? Is it some department that does that? You have to really expand a much broader base of possible solutions out there and bring those down.
So this is the key point. It is the who aspect, and bringing in psychology, creativity, behavioral science, in addition to metrics, expands that solution space. Scenario planning is great, but we need to expand the people that are involved in scenario planning.
Okay. Laurie Amos finds this very interesting, but is asking, where does quantum and systems thinking rather than linear Newtonian thinking fit in? And what about the use of complex adaptive systems theory?
Well, I certainly think systems thinking is really what this is all about. You look at a systems thinking chart and you see a complex picture, but it does attempt to try and identify most of the issues which are at stake. So I would say systems thinking is the overall broad discipline, which is the best process to tackle uncertainty.
Now, Peter Lavery is curious. The energy crisis in Europe is a known with the degree of uncertainty on the outcome. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, but it should have been a known unknown. Although the reactions of many of the countries, they looks as though they've lived in quadrant 3. So yes, we should have seen this coming. We should have seen someone trying to, in the future, trying to blow up the pipelines as well. So that's just good contingency planning. And if they're not doing that, then why are these people in charge of our politics?
Dan Finney is curious, how can we avoid drowning in too much data, especially useless or irrelevant data? He wonders if AI can help here or make decisions, or is this just going to make decisions even less optimal? And he has a second question, which I find quite interesting. Are strategy consultants such as Boston and McKinsey still useful in a VUCA world? I'm curious about that because there has been a genuine decline in strategy assignments, not necessarily in these consultancies, but in the strategy practices of their work.
No, I think I'll take this.
And you take the same. Certainly, there is so much data, and that is part of the problem. And I firmly believe that AI can help, as long as we are aware of the biases that might go into the development of any algorithms that take place. But yes, AI is the only way, the future way I see of actually trying to handle a mass of weak signals and trying to make sense of them.
We don't normally like the political questions, but I can't resist this one. This is Clive Bullen. Well done, Clive. Should the Prime Minister Liz Truss have seen that tax cuts for the richest could have been a problem, or was there too much uncertainty to see that? And how would you analyze how much uncertainty there is at the moment for the UK's economy and standing in the world?
I think there are 2 aspects there. The first question, the media have talked, particularly even under the former Prime Minister, how diverse the cabinet has been, how diverse those sitting around the table are. But they're not. You can be different, so as long as you conform. Never has it been seen greater when the Conservative Party chairman spoke yesterday about what would happen if people were to vote against these tax changes. So in terms of the first part of the question, yes, we should have seen it coming. Yes, she should have seen it coming. She probably could have seen it coming had she had more of the dissenting voices around the table. Can you remind me, Michael, sorry, the second part of the question?
The second part was, how would you analyze how much uncertainty there is at the moment for the UK's economy and standing in the world?
Well, I think on both, the 2 separate questions, how much uncertainty and the UK standing. Further to the statement last week from the IMF, and certainly reading international newspapers, we have been portrayed as the sick man of Europe. So in terms of reputation and standing, we have taken a bit of a battering, and there's probably a number of events before that, again, that we should have seen them coming. In terms of the economy, we are dealing with significant uncertainty. And when I say we, the average person on the street. So whilst a lot of the debate has been focused on the degrees of intervention, the average British, because we are now talking about politics, the average British citizen and the average voter has a great degree of uncertainty in life, from the previous question on the energy crisis through to this question on the changes that were announced last week and what may or may not happen. So these are very uncertain, worrying times for the great British public, Michael.
Okay. Just quickly, one item there. Certainly, systems thinking would have certainly helped in this case. We know a lot of the civil servants themselves they do all this stuff. It's not a case they don't do it. It's just that, should we say, that their political leaders have decided not to listen them to, and I don't know what the problem. I don't know how to overcome that issue of what I call silo thinking. That's a problem that the politicians, probably all parties, have to address.
Well, it was a few years ago. I was actually looking to see the UK's risk register, which I presumed one existed. I'd been working off of the World Economic Forum one for general global risk. I thought I'd see if the UK had one, and of course we did. And it fell under the Paymaster General, and it was done under Penny Mordaunt's suzerainty. And what was interesting was it had the pandemic, high impact and high likelihood. But yeah, nobody reads these things, sadly. So there you go. We've got a couple of other comments, but I'd like to close on a couple questions of my own. But just before I do so, Paul K points out that if you're looking to deconstruct uncertainty, surely there's a need also to deconstruct types of uncertainty as part of this, and not just look at anything where you can't assign a probability. It is possible to deconstruct this a little bit more, and each one has different uncertainty management challenges. And Laurie Amos says that all of this confirms that leadership needs to change to trust and encourage others' input rather than default of I'm in charge, I know everything, and tell people what to do, which I think is a very good point. I just wanted to turn for a moment to your unknown knowns area. One, a bit like you, for years I've said Rumsfeld was no idiot. This is a brilliant quadrant, but the interesting bit is he didn't focus on the fourth bit of the quadrant. And the example I've always given is a firm that I knew where they sold outsourcing services overseas, and the head of one of their clients would come to their offices all the time, and he would be coming in typically either very early or quite late on flights, and he would come by and he would find that the cleaner spoke his native language. And meanwhile, the management were priding themselves on, superior service and why these people were purchasing. And anyway, they got rid of the cleaner, not realizing that it was the cleaner's knowledge of the language. And that was the only thing that distinguished them from their competitors. And the minute the cleaner disappeared, the contract was transferred. So really interesting how that sort of thing can work. But the question for you, though, is in that category of unknown knowns, and in fact, to some degree in all of this uncertainty, when should you sit back and wait? Because doesn't uncertainty also give you future opportunities?
Most certainly it does. And I think that don't always think that thinking about uncertainty is to try and find the bad news. Certainly in the design process, product design and areas like that, and innovation, you've got to look at what uncertainties can allow you to come up with new products. And again, many of the methods can be ported over to what I would call design, innovation, and creativity processes.
Daushan, anything from you?
I think Laurie, one of the participants or the attendees here, I think Laurie summed it up well. She spoke about leadership, and leadership needs to be embracing. Your example of the cleaner resonates with an example I have as well. It's sometimes the things that you don't see, and having those, again, going back to the questions, those strategists, those management consultants in a room, you miss the magic of the normal sometimes, as your cleaning example gives. And I think Laurie, again, to come back to Laurie, I don't know, but I love the summary and the question for that. It is about leadership, and leadership being all embracing. So we do expand our solution spaces, because nobody would have put the cleaner in a solution space for that piece of business development, Michael.
Well, sadly, we've come to the end of time. That's the one certain thing in life, is that time will come to an end, I guess. And there are many, many quotes along the lines of, I used to be certain that everything was uncertain, but now I'm not so sure. So I'll leave all that sort of stuff for another day, or perhaps a drink. But I think it's been great to have both of you on board to remind us of the importance here, and in particular that you've given this a lot of thought, a lot of considered thought. And the book is getting great reviews, both on Amazon and from various bodies, such as the management consultants, etc. And definitely a book to commend to the audience. Now, if I may, I've got 3 quick rounds of thanks. Firstly, again, to our sponsors. Without you, we couldn't do these things, and I hope you feel more certain than ever that FS Club is worth sponsoring. Secondly, may I thank the audience. Again, as always, you've been great today. I've got a little correction here that Laurie Ames is actually apparently also John Knight's, but we'll figure out what was going on there some other time. I guess they're watching it together. But most of all, the thanks are to both of you for taking the time to present, for taking the time to share your thinking, and we appreciate the fact that you've put even more into a book that is continually becoming more and more well regarded. So thank you very much for that. And I'm afraid one uncertainty here at FS Club is that we have no way of providing applause from the audience because the system doesn't open up for that. But I do have here our Korean karmic clapper, which I'm afraid will have to be our ersatz spit, and I hope you didn't expect that. Anyway, take care, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.